Hello, welcome to another session. Today we're going to be talking about the French Revolution. Since the American Revolution is discussed so much in all the way throughout grade school, junior high, and even high school, I'm not going to dwell too much on the American Revolution. Certainly I'll draw upon it, but today more or less we're going to be looking into the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution certainly has an impact, certainly on France, but also many other parts around the world. Some of the background of the French Revolution. Certainly, France has contributed its navy and a lot of funding to the American Revolution as they helped. First off, they recognized the United States as a country, so they got their start there. But also through the period of funding a navy, fighting the battles against the British during that period of time. In addition, they also sent their army and supplied essentially all the arms for the American army during that conflict. Certainly the Americans had quite a few arms themselves, but the French supplied about half of the arms to the Americans, and they supplied the artillery, and certainly they had a navy. So that was extraordinarily costly for the French monarchy, and that is certainly going to play a factor in this entire situation. So as far as the social structure going on in France at this time, you do have essentially what they call three estates. The first estate will consist of the clergy in France. The second estate will consist of the nobility. And the third estate will consist of the commoners, or pretty much everybody else. So the third estate is going to be about 80% of the population. These are going to be farmers, they're going to be businessmen, those sorts of people. The first estate will consist of about 130,000 people, being the clergy. The second estate will be the nobility, about 350,000 people, and then of course the rest of the population, which is going to consist of millions of peasants. They're separated into these three different estates, and these sorts of estates have been established since the medieval period. What you have in the third estate is now you're getting a rising class that we today call the middle class. They're going to be wealthy individuals who have businesses, and they start gaining a lot of wealth through all the trade and commerce going on in Europe at this time. The middle class is fresh and new, and something that most people don't really know how to deal with, at least at this period of time. The middle class don't have titles or power, but they have money. With this money, they can invest in other businesses, they can throw money to buy products, and in the case of these revolutions, certainly the American Revolution, the middle class was able to certainly fund a lot of political movements. They were able to arm themselves. In some cases, they were able to convince people through money, basically bribery, to get what they wanted. And these people didn't have the title, so they got what they wanted through essentially work. That was something that some nobles didn't have any experience with. And so you have a rising population and wealth being produced in this middle class, which certainly allowed them to have some influence on society. This is a changing situation in France at this period of time, and it's certainly happening all over Europe, but it becomes a huge problem in France. I'm not saying the middle class is a problem, but some of the situations that will develop will be influenced greatly by this middle class. The middle class will have literacy, they'll know how to read and write, they're going to grab onto a lot of these enlightened ideas. And then this American experiment of revolution also started just prior to the French Revolution. So quite a few people are fully aware of the American Revolution and what they've been doing, forming their government by popular sovereignty and getting away from kingships kingships, nobility, and those sorts of things. So the French government is going along with life as it normally had done. They had a king, they had the nobles, the clergy, and the common people. Things were going all right, but after the American Revolution, they started to see an economic downturn. Now, part of this was because they had spent so much money funding this war, and there were previous wars to the American Revolution. They also had the 7 Years' War. They were involved in many different wars. King Louis the 13th and 14th were involved in many wars throughout Europe, and this was very, very costly. And so they're trying to pay off their debt. In fact, at this point, about half their budget was in interest to all the debt that they had accrued. So finances were a huge problem. But in 1787 and 1788, they had some bad harvests. And so food was scarce. Many people starved, and it was very expensive to buy this food. And the peasants at this time were still relatively poor, and so they couldn't afford a lot of the food and other general items they would need to live, and certainly paying taxes and rent and those sorts of things. So what you developed is an economic depression of sorts going on at this time. And so as a result, there was a financial crisis. Once again, they can't pay their bills, they couldn't pay their debt. They had spent a lot of money on these wars, fighting Britain, and devoted a lot of money towards the United States. This certainly didn't help their financial situation. As a result, a financial crisis occurred, and so they summoned the Estates General, which was essentially the parliament in France. You had about 300 delegates each for the first and the second estate, so 300 for the clergy, 300 for the nobility, and then you had 600 delegates for the third estate, that being the peasants. And most of these delegates were lawyers, middle-class citizens, and certainly city dwellers. These group of people, they all met at the Estates General Parliament on May 5th, 1789. And so the first argument was how each of their votes would count. Certainly you would get a tie if each person of the first and second estate voted with one another, and then the third estate, if they voted with the third estate, you wouldn't really get anywhere. There wouldn't be a majority. And so part of the problem was trying to figure out how to solve the problem. And for the most part, most of the individuals in the first and second estate, and to some degree also the third estate, voted for changes that would benefit themselves, and not really addressing the problems with taxes. Part of the solution to potentially ending this financial crisis was to increase taxes, but each of these estates didn't want to do it, or they wanted to be exempt from taxes. That didn't help the situation. So as a result, it wasn't resolved. And so what happened on June 20th is actually the first and second estate locked the doors to the parliament, so the third estate couldn't get in and voice their concerns or vote. So they thought this might solve their little debacle, and then the first and second estate could agree on many of their problems. And so what the third estate did was they formed their own congress of sorts in the indoor tennis courts. This is generally called the tennis court convention or oath. And so they started discussing amongst themselves and trying to form a constitution, very much in the same fashion as what was going on in the United States, since many of these people paid quite a bit of attention to what was going on in America through the Revolution and certainly afterwards. And so they start forming their own constitution. But then King Louis starts to get word of this, and so do many other individuals, certainly nobles, are getting some sort of word that this is going on. And as a result, what the government starts to do, which is fairly common at this time, was they decide to send an army to crush this, basically what they see as rebellion of sorts, which this is pretty common. This is how most rulers solve these problems. So with the threat of ending the Constitution, ending their representation, peasants start to organize, they start to rebel, and they attack the Bastille. They succeed, and that's July 14th on 1789, and they confiscate a lot of arms. And so the peasant rebellion ensues all throughout July and into August. And now that they have the weapons as well as artillery pieces from the Bastille, part of the reason why they were able to do this is because of the commander there didn't want to fire upon French citizens, and so they took advantage of that and confiscated the place. And this really starts the French Revolution, or at least the more famous aspects of the French Revolution. A great fear ensued. The monarchy was surrounded by angry peasants with guns and artillery pieces. That certainly wasn't pleasant. And there was a lack of leadership. So now with the third estate, the peasants now in control, since they certainly outnumbered the nobility, they had the weapons, and as a result, on August 4th, 1789, with their new constitution and certainly with their new convention, they decide to end the titles and land claims for the nobility. And so that's going to be abolished on August 4th, 1789. The idea behind this, of course, is to remove the power of the nobility. Now, at this point, they arrest the king, and the commoners still have and maintain control over the city. Many of the city's services come to a screeching halt. Stability is certainly not the rule of the day. So as a result, many of the city life is chaos. Everyone's kind of out on their own. They certainly have some political leaders in basically the lawyers in the middle class. They have weapons, they're organizing themselves as a militia, but there isn't any sort of clean and clear order. What happens is, what they do is they start to organize and try and make their own laws. They have their own constitution. They're modeling many of these things on, of course, the American Revolution. Now, the king in June 1791 tries to escape, but he is unsuccessful, and the peasants grab him as they put him in prison. He is surrounded, he's not going to get away. They are rather annoyed with him since, of course, he did try to send the army to kill them and end this rebellion. So they basically put him in house arrest. Now, Austria on April 20th, 1792, declares war. They see this as an advantageous situation. Maybe they can grab some French lands, and so they take advantage of that situation. But basically, every man is going to be armed, and they're going to go to the front and try to fight this war. So they do go to the borders, the eastern borders of France. They have mass recruitment, basically a draft, which has not been seen in Europe. This may be fairly common in societies now when there's an emergency situation, but back then that really didn't happen. So you just have a massive number of soldiers with guns who are going to the borders, and they put the Austrian soldiers on hold. Austrians do have some success in the beginning, but they start to wear down and they hold them on the border of France. So if you think of the situation, you have an army of citizens out on the border of France fighting a war. You're trying to figure out how to organize your government, how to pass laws and create order in Paris and many of the other different cities. So you have a lot of chaos going on. There's no complete order being established. They form a national convention on September of 1792, and what they do there of significance is on the 21st, they abolish the monarchy. And so now there's no king. And so they organize the execution of King Louis, the 16th this one is, on January 21st, 1793. And so they behead him. And so now there is no longer a monarchy in France, and this has quite a bit of an effect on the rest of Europe. People are just shocked at this behavior, and they're very fearful of many of the public generally. Countries start looking at their own people potentially as problems. You have this idea that you need to crush the populations if there's any sort of rebellion, and they're very hesitant and mistrusting of a lot of the general public. So this affects Austria, it affects Prussia and Russia, to the point the British are also very nervous as well, but they're certainly a little more open to free speech than these other countries. Since many of these other countries are absolute states, with kings, they have a little bit more to lose. Certainly in Britain, you have a bit more representation than those other areas. You have a domestic crisis with cutting off the head of King Louis. You have a new convention that is still trying to figure out their own rule of law, how to go through procedures, which is very much what the United States is doing at this time as well. They had just formed the United States Constitution that we use today because they found out that the Articles of Confederation was largely ineffective. They also have a foreign crisis because that now, at this time of the 1790s, they are losing military engagements. They were able to hold off the Austrians for some time, but as time goes on, the war wears on. Supplies are not getting to the front. They need more men. They keep shuffling more men into these areas, but there isn't any sort of organized general leading all these different militias. So they're steadily losing these battles too. So they mobilize the entirety of the nation and send more troops en masse into the borders of France to try to defeat the Austrians. Alright. Now, what we have is a Committee of Public Safety is going to be established in July of 1793 all the way to July of 1794. This is also termed the Reign of Terror. The reason why it's called the Reign of Terror is now the general public is also a little wary of one another. They're in power, they don't want to lose that power, and so what they do is they establish martial law, and anyone on the streets past a certain time, it's very much like curfew, they're going to be seen as an enemy or a spy. They're very nervous about Austria and all these other powers may be influencing French policy. So as a result, they are not very trustworthy. And so they establish all these different laws, martial law certainly, and you'll be imprisoned or killed on sight. And so there's a period where there's mass executions. The guillotine is very famous in this period of time, in part because so many groups of people need to be executed. They execute nobility, they execute clergy, they execute the peasants, pretty much anyone who causes any sort of problems. And initially when they started this, they beheaded people through the sword. But very quickly they found out after about 3 beheadings the sword got very dull, and so they'd have to wait and resharpen it and then start over. But they had hundreds of people to execute. And so as a result, you see the guillotine using gravity and weight to behead people, using basically force to behead people. And so that's how the guillotine is created and established. Over time, it basically devolved into something of a civil war. You have many different factions of political groups in France. They, from time to time, are stable, but very quickly they destabilize. They're killing one another and trying to upseat one another, and a lot of conspiracy, assassinations, bribery, a very chaotic situation. And so the Committee of Public Safety comes to an end in 1794 with the execution of Maximilien Robespierre, which is the general leader at that time. They went through many different leaders at this time too, but due to the chaos, they were short-lived. Alright, so what we have coming out of that situation is obviously a very chaotic situation for France at this time. They've been trying to organize, create a government. This revolution of sorts certainly wasn't peaceful revolution. It was a very violent revolution. And nothing is far more violent than the American Revolution. Certainly there were people in the American Revolution that were loyal to the British and loyal to the American cause, but for the most part, it was relatively bloodless, at least among the Americans themselves. Certainly there were rivalries going on, and there was death on both sides, but in France it was essentially a bloodbath where groups were fighting amongst themselves. This certainly didn't help situations. They are also being attacked by the Austrians, and essentially there was chaos all over the place. So this sort of situation leaves the door open for Napoleon, or the Age of Napoleon. He enters the situation, and he rises through the ranks of the military to take a handle on this situation. So we're going to end here. Basically, once Napoleon comes into the fold, France is still relatively chaotic. You have a lot of civil war, a lot of rivalries, a lot of violence within France itself. You have violence on the borders of France. They're still floundering and trying to form their own government on the democratic ideals of the Enlightenment, as well as trying to form order. So the Enlightenment certainly has a contributing factor on France, and really it's a very chaotic situation. Many historians as well as political analysts argue that the French Revolution has not ended, and this sort of revolution goes beyond France itself, and France is still messing around and trying to figure itself out after the French Revolution. So we'll leave this here, and certainly bring this back up on the Age of Napoleonic era. Till then, have a nice day. See you later.